Hello and welcome to Basin Academy Basin Safety Monthly Safety Trainings. This is your safety instructor, Jonathan Greiner, and this month, March 2023, we're going to be covering hand and power tools, personal protective equipment, and noise exposure hearing conservation. As always, take these topics and apply them to your safety culture company-wide and not just to individual ways of working. So with that, let's get this safety started. Alright, so getting right into hand and power tools safety. Hand tools are simple tools used to make tasks easier. We know this, we use them in our garages, we use them at home, we use them at work, we use them every day all the time. And hand injuries are the most common workplace injury. I've mentioned this before, but Peterbilt, a large truck manufacturing company, did a $1 million study to say, where do our guys get hurt the most? Lo and behold, surprise, surprise, the answer was using wrenches. So, in mechanicking, roustabouting, any sort of technical job where you have to get into things or tweak things or move things, hand tools are necessary as a part of the job. So some of these tools are simple, some of them are more complex, and each one is going to have its own set of hazards. Some of those dangers and hazards include cuts, scrapes, pinches, amputations, impaling, and smashing. Now, depending on the nature of the work and what it is you're working with, if it's moving, if it's stationary, if it's bolted to a table, if it's going up and down, obviously the risks are going to change. So you need to evaluate each of those things individually based on what type of tool you're using and what happens if the tool gets kicked off or broken in the middle of working. What could happen and what do you do to prevent that from happening? So proper tool selection is probably one of the bigger items in this as well. So making sure we're using the right tool for the job. The right size tool as well, and don't use tools for jobs they're not intended for. A wrench as a hammer is pretty common. I see that a lot. And at home, right? Like the hammer, you left it in on the other side of the house, or you left it in the truck, and you just got to bang this thing in real quick. It's easy to use the wrench that's just right there handy, but especially at work, those are the sorts of things that maybe in an individual case won't get someone hurt, but over time, the lack of quality practice will cause an injury because someone may see you doing that and be like, hey, I can do that too, and use it in an improper way in a more risky situation. So slippage while using tools is another thing, making sure it's held firm, and then whatever it's in contact with, it's firm before you start moving if you're applying pressure. And then again, using the right PPE. After we selected the right PPE or the right tool, make sure it's the right fit, size, slip resistant, whatever. Then after all that's been evaluated, PPE, because PPE is the last line of defense, which we'll get into in the next topic more in depth. So knives and razors are one major area where cuts happen, specifically razor blades in a configuration where, as you can see in the photo here on the upper left, where it's kind of a fixed razor blade. Those do cause a lot of injuries every year, a lot of OSHA recordable injuries. So making sure, that first of all, the blade's sharp, because if it's not sharp, you're going to have to use it multiple times. And that may sound like an oxymoron. Hey, these are dangerous, so make sure they're really sharp, But ultimately, yes, we want them to be sharp so that their utilization is effective. Obviously, we don't want to cut towards ourselves or towards other people. We want to make sure that we got a firm grip on them when we're using them. Again, the right size knife for the job that we're using. Sometimes a razor blade is the best bet. Sometimes something a little bit, firmer, thicker, etc. that's not going to break on us is a better tool. They don't like pocket knives at work. People, everyone has their favorite knife, originally most people were going to be using, kind of the Leatherman style or the Swiss Army knives, and some of those tools are really good for utilization, but not at work because they're flimsy, and the care and maintenance of those isn't quality. Sometimes you've had them for 20 years, and those aren't the best tools typically for a lot of jobs. And then also, again, always cutting away from yourself. I'm going to reiterate that. Cut away from yourself, your knee, your finger, your foot, your leg, your arm. Don't have any part of your body in the cut path of a knife at any time. Hammers are another area where we see a lot of injuries for multiple reasons. Typically, if the construction of the hammer is such that over time it will degrade and break down, chemicals can affect, typically wood, right? Chemicals can affect that, etc. Typically your steel core hammer with a rubber grip, that one's not going to, typically splinter and break. And if it does, I don't know what you're doing, but it's hammer's probably not the right job. So, making sure that you use a hammer and only a hammer when a hammer is required instead of wrenches, your hand, other tools, etc. And most of the reason for that is you're applying, momentum and friction and force. And if the tool doesn't have a good, head on it or etc., then your hand or another part of your body may follow that force up if and when that tool slips, and you can get hurt that way. We want to make sure we're holding the handle at the base of the hammer. We don't want to choke it. Typically, depending on the amount of force that we're putting in, brass hammers are required where there's potential for spark. So we don't want to use a steel hammer. If steel against steel can cause spark, and against other metals, so brass, prevents that from happening. It will dent before it will spark, right? And also keeping your body out of the swing radius and other people out of the swing radius when you're swinging a hammer, especially if you're swinging it, very hard. Pliers and wrenches. Now, again, slipping, we talked about this before. This is that in that Peterbilt study, this is where they found people got hurt using wrenches. They slip, right? So people are working, their wrench slips and their hand hits something or comes into contact with a moving part, or the energy and friction behind it pushes it in such a way that it hurts a knuckle, scrapes, bruise, etc. So we want to make sure that we're kind of cognizant of the grip that the wrench has on whatever it is that we're trying to move. We want to make sure they're adjusted properly, keep our hands out of pinch points. Sometimes a power tool would be more useful, a power tool with a wrench or a bit or a nut on it, rather than, using a hand tool. And that's really, again, going to be a decision that you make when planning the job. Also making sure that we have the right sized tool. So if we're using a wrench, particularly if we're using Allen wrenches, if we're using, sockets, we want to make sure that if they're SEA or metric, standard or metric, that they're the proper one, because they'll fit the bolt, but will they slip? Typically, if it's the wrong type, it's very likely. Fixed wrenches are always better than non-fixed wrenches as well. Just kind of keep that in mind. Open-ended or crescent is like everyone has a crescent wrench in their pickup or their pocket in the field, but sometimes that's not the best fit. It's better to have a correct closed-end wrench than a crescent wrench or an adjustable wrench. So hand and power tools specifically, these have come a long way from the early days, especially when the standard first came out. We're talking the 70s. And if you've ever used a power tool from the 70s, you can see why it was important to have some sort of standard related to these tools. So they're very handy, do a lot of things, and more, I saw a guy on the internet who'd actually used a drill to kind of configure this baby rocker. So the drill was turning and the little rocker was rocking the baby in front of the TV. Very smart. I don't know if I'd necessarily do it myself. There might be a better system than a drill, but it worked. Rather than him having to rock, he just held the trigger down on the drill. I think he had modified it so that the trigger was held down by itself. But either way, that's perfectly fine at home if you feel comfortable doing it. It worked. That's a no-no. So we want to make sure tools are used for their proper purpose. Attachments are inspected and tightened properly. Guards that should be there are there. We want to make sure that intrinsically safe areas, we're using power tools that are actually intrinsically safe. That's pretty much an important requirement. Drills, same kind of thing. Slipping can happen here. We want to make sure the bits are in good shape. We want to make sure that the power is sufficient for the type of work that we're doing. You shouldn't have to put your entire body weight behind a drill for it to do its job, right? That's either an undersized drill, an underpowered drill. We want to make sure that it's relatively easy. Saws, I don't have to tell you, if you've ever worked with one of these, they can be dangerous. Obviously, we have something very sharp moving at a high rate of speed intended to cut through something. So depending on the guards that are in place, sometimes that will go a long way to preventing potentially getting cut. They even have blades, smart blades, that will detect soft flesh or a finger so that, if your finger gets in there, it will stop. This allows, essentially what we want to do is prevent any part of our body or clothing getting caught into one of these. And there's been many times, not just in saws, but in engines and articulating parts and moving parts where clothing has been drawn in and then caused an injury by sucking the person into the equipment or the saw. So keep that in mind. Good practice, especially with handheld saws, to unplug them when you're not using them. Always make sure that they're stopped fully before moving in to grab your wood or your pipe or your metal or whatever it is you're working with. And again, to reiterate, make sure guards are in place. Probably equally as dangerous and candidly more injuries happen with these every year are grinders. Guards, I see these videos all the time where the guard wasn't in place and someone gets hurt, and I see a lot of situations where the guard was in place and people didn't get hurt. So there's a direct correlation between the guard, and now the guards are adjustable in some cases. The guard is designed to be between you and the blade. All right, so you should not see the grind directly from the direction that your body is. That there should be a guard there. Now, if you turn your head and look at it, then you can see it. But downwards, that's where the guard should be, so that if the blade breaks, then or our wheel breaks, then it doesn't break into us; it breaks away from us. So we want to make sure that we test those before we use them. Not a bad idea to unbolt it. Make sure it's got a little ding to the ring or ring to the ding if you ding it on a piece of metal. If not, if you hear a thud or a dud, that means that it has a crack or a fracture inside of the wheel. So we want to make sure that we're replacing those as much as we can. Earplugs are another piece of this, and we'll get into that more with PPE. Decibel ratings, if you're making loud noises, we want to protect our ears. Sparks and other debris coming from work that we're doing, we want to make sure that also is not coming towards us or other people. We want to make sure that when we set the grinder down or we're done with it, we unplug it and then also set it so the wheel is up. Make sure that it stops spinning before we set it down. Make sure all guards are in place at all times, again, and then do our ring test before we use them. So in general, using these tools, we got to be extremely careful. They do come apart. They do break. We want to make sure we have stable surfaces that we're working on. We want to make sure they're inspected. Every nut that's there is tightened appropriately. The blades are sharp that we're using if we're using blades. They're designed for the type of material that we're cutting or puncturing or drilling through. And then again, we have the right sized power tool or hand tool for the job. And that's all we got on hand and power tool safety. We go into a little bit more in depth on the electrical part of this and the electrical safety training that we do. So you can sign up for that if you want to. Let us know. We also have Basin Academy, which is you can go topic by topic. It's not a monthly type training, but you can choose different topics to go through and get certified in those courses as well. All right, personal protective equipment. Moving into our next topic for the day. What do you need to know? A lot. The most important thing, again, with PPE is to know that it's the last line of defense. And I'm going to beat that home today. We are going to make sure this is understood. I've seen a lot of JSAs, for example, where guys will write out their job, and if I could, I would change the name of it from JSA to JFA for job failure analysis, because things can go wrong that aren't necessarily just safety related. And I think everything should be assessed from a productivity perspective. But hey, that's just me. No one asked. You didn't ask, but there you are. But yes, it is the last line of defense, and I'm going to hammer that home. So we're going to talk about hazards and why we select PPE, how to go through the process of doing a hazard analysis to determine the right type of PPE, why that PPE is selected, and then lastly, how to wear and care for PPE. All right, so we're going to be doing a quick PPE quiz here. I like to do these just to kind of get an idea of how much you know, so we'll go through these really quick. So the question number 1, hazard assessments are conducted only for job functions that involve hazardous materials. Number 2, your employer is responsible for selecting PPE. Number 3, PPE should be inspected before each use. And number 4, it is not important to keep your PPE clean. All right. So, number 1, hazard assessments are conducted only for job functions that involve hazardous materials. That's false. Your employer is responsible for selecting PPE. Absolutely true. PPE should be inspected before each use. Also true. And lastly, it is not important to keep your PPE clean. That's a false statement. Probably got those right, but again, good to kind of measure where you're at. All right, hazard assessment. This is kind of the hazard assessment triangle, as we call it. So starting from the top, going towards the bottom, this is also the greatest level of defense. or primary. You can do it, numerically. Number 1 is elimination, 2 is substitution, then down to last we can see is PPE. So that's our last line of defense. So we're going to evaluate every job function, determine if hazards are present, which we do in JSAs. 3, check for all hazards to parts of the body, environment, assets. Is this going to blow up? Is it going to fail? Are we going to run out of fuel? Is the truck not going to get here on time? All these are things that we need to evaluate for severity. Determine appropriate PPE, and again, PPE is the last line of defense. Keep that in mind. It's true. Everything else needs to be evaluated first, and then lastly for PPE. So the first thing we're going to look at is a face and eye assessment. And we're just going to start from the top and work our way down, skipping the hard hat and going to that last. But is there anything that can hit us in the face, right? So flying particles, molten metal, hazardous liquid, acid or caustic liquids, gases or vapors, or light radiation. So in this image, for example, there's a gentleman who is about to do some hydrovac work but does not have a face shield installed. Without that face shield, as you're spraying high pressured water into the dirt that contains rocks, some of those rocks may fly back towards you, hit you in the face, hit you in the eyes, cause pain, and it just prevents you from doing work. And no one ever said, man, that's a good worker, but he goes to the hospital every week. No one's ever said that. Those things are not the same. So, making sure that we're assessing what can happen to our face in any job we're doing, using hand tools, using power tools, using a hydrovac, whatever it is that we're doing. All right, the next area we're going to look at is respiratory protection and kind of conducting that hazard assessment. We're going to look at airborne dust or particulates that may be in our work area, vapors or fumes, lack of adequate oxygen, looking at where the sources of those items are, making sure our work processes aren't creating those things, and then monitoring the exposure to determine what is our respiratory hazard, right? This is before we select the PPE. We just say, what's out there? What do we have that could potentially hurt us? Hearing hazard assessment. Really, this one's pretty straightforward. We conduct a noise survey. You can get a survey tool online for like $80. You're going to look at, how long someone's going to be around that area, what do they have in distance between a loud noise, and then what shielding do they have? Is there a sound barrier? Is it inside of a room, etc.? Monitor those employees and then repeat monitoring, and we're going to go more in depth in that in a little bit. Then we're going to be talking about our head hazard assessment. Are there falling objects, exposed electrical conductors, low-hanging obstructions, suspended loads that we're walking under, and then any sharp objects in path or near slippery surfaces. So if we can, and this kind of goes into our next one, is there something that if we were to slip and fall that it would hurt our head dramatically or another part of our body? These are all things we want to assess when looking at what can harm our head in general. Our foot hazard assessment. So we're going to look for anything that could fall, roll, sharp objects that may puncture our foot, electrical hazards, slippery walking surfaces, hazardous materials, and cold or warm weather conditions. Warm usually isn't so much of an issue, right? Like I've never heard someone said, my foot got too hot because it was hot outside and now I can't walk. That's not typical. Staying dry is another thing entirely. So, are we working in wet conditions? That's something else we want to consider. So scoria, for example, this is just an example that I like to use because it's very common in what we do. There's scoria out there. A lot of ankle injuries every year, continues to happen. These is something we're going to look for slippery surfaces or unstable working surfaces. Getting into slippery surfaces, is there ice, snow, compacted snow on a location? Here's an example of a location where it's kind of right there in springtime where most of the snow is melted. It's kind of collected there across the location. But just like this week, you can go from being 30 to 20 to minus 10 all in a week. And obviously that's going to create a different work surface than the week before, so keep that in mind. There are ways to increase friction, other things we want to look at, chains, PVC grips, midsole cleats. I go into this in walking working surfaces very in depth, but here's some examples of things you can do to increase friction. Then we're going to do a hand hazard assessment. Are there materials or chemicals that can be absorbed into the skin? Is there possible for a cut or a laceration? Severe abrasions, punctures, chemical burns, thermal burns, frostbite, all these things we have to look at our job and say, what can hurt our hands? Clothing assessment. Are we working around things that could potentially catch on fire? Are we working with hot materials, hazardous materials? Are we welding and sparks are flying everywhere? Are there heavy, sharp, or rough materials we could run into or fall into? Is there moving machinery that could pull our clothing in? All of these are things we want to assess when we're looking at what kind of clothing we select for the job. Eye and face protection. So, we we did the assessment, what could hurt us. Now we're getting into selecting the right PPE and then making sure it's cared for. And rather than going back and forth, we're going to go selection and then care and maintenance, kind of back to back on each of these. So can we see is kind of the first thing, right? So we may need prescription eyewear, even if it's a safety glass, in order to be able to see what we're doing properly. Do we need shaded filter lenses? Essentially, are there certain spectrums of light that could harm our eyes? Face shields for sparks, things like that. Safety glasses, goggles for dusts and materials that can get into our eyes. And all of these must be ANSI Z87 rated. That has a lot to do with the construction and ensuring that the material does not allow punctures and nails and things like that to just go right through them. So they all have to be ANSI Z87 for impact protection. So caring for eye protection is pretty straightforward. Glasses, goggles, face shields, they all get scratched, which obviously impedes our ability to see well. We also want to make sure that it fits comfortably. We want to make sure that we're wearing it before the exposure starts. They're cleaned, make sure that we can see those scratches and we can see clearly. If they're damaged or wrecked or unusable because they're scratched, we got to get rid of them, and we just want to make sure that we do that. All right, selecting respiratory protection. So obviously supplied air in a full face application is the best, the highest protection that we can get, because this is providing us with a clean atmosphere. Our entire face is covered. Nothing's getting our nose, our eyes, our lungs, our mouth. All that stuff's protected, right? So that's the highest level of protection. But for different reasons, that may not be necessary. So we have cartridge half masks and also full masks. So you can get this in both. You can have a full mask that has cartridges or a half mask. That's kind of our medium protection. And the lowest protection is a filtering half mask or just a blocking half mask, such as the one that we see in the photo here. So depending on what you're doing, the hazards that you're associated with, you're going to select one of these three types when respiratory protection is required. So a couple other things, we have air supplied and we have self-contained when we're talking about full face piece, atmosphere providing. So we want to keep that in mind. And then caring for this stuff, we want to make sure that everyone's fit tests, make sure that the respirator fits them properly. We want to inspect it before each use and do a pressure test, both a positive and a negative, every time we put it on, and people have to be medically approved prior to wearing a respirator. So even before we get into the wear and care, this is the wear part, now we're going to talk about the care part. So we want to make sure the seal works. We want to make sure we clean it regularly with antibacterial non-alcohol wipes, because the alcohol wipes will actually break down the rubber components of this equipment. We want to make sure we store it properly in a dry area where it's not getting chemicals and moisture and gunk and bacteria in there. And then if something's wrong, we want to replace the whole unit or the failed part of the unit immediately before we go to work. All right, so I'm going to briefly cover hearing protection here. We're going to go a lot more in depth in the next topic here today, so I'm not going to go super deep, but there are three different types of hearing protection, and just like respiratory protection, depending on the level of sound that you're experiencing, you're going to have different levels of protection you're going to want to go for. So you have the highest protection, which is earmuffs, and then also combined with the medium protection, earplugs, is your best level of protection. Those two together is really the best way to go. But there's obviously downsides to that. So then we have the medium protection, just earplugs, and lowest protection, which are canal caps. So taking care of these, just the biggest thing is making sure that they fit right. They do have custom earplugs, and again, in the next section, I'm going to go more in depth in that. We want to inspect them before each use. We want to make sure they're clean. We don't want to put dirty stuff in our ears. Used to only protect the head, so don't put them in your nostrils, for example, for respiratory protection. That's a no-go. All right, selecting foot protection. We went over this briefly a little bit ago, but there are different types of boots for different scenarios. So they all need to be ANSI, just like Z87 for glasses. This one's Z41, so we want to make sure they're ANSI Z41. These are work boots. Mostly what that's dealing with is puncture proof from the ground up. So there's typically a level of protection. So if you step on something sharp, it's not going to go right through the sole of your boot into your foot. So all right, so the wear and care of foot protection is pretty straightforward. Most of us know how to make sure our boots are in good shape, but a few things can cause issues with these. We want to make sure that they fit comfortably. First of all, you don't want to be getting home every day with blisters or bunions or something. So we want to make sure that that your foot isn't moving around inside. Slip resistance is a big thing. For me, that's usually what goes out first on my boots as the soles get a little bit worn down, and then ice and any sort of slippery surfaces really impacts it. But also inspecting more so for, we definitely want to make sure there's no holes, so the soles aren't broken or cracked or anything. And then the chemical boots, that's really where the issues can happen, is if there's cracks in those or tears in those that would allow chemicals to seep in. So you just want to make sure you check them every day before you put them on. Make sure that they're fitting and suitable for work. Hand protection. So gloves are its own world for hand protection. You have impact gloves, chemical-resistant gloves, cut-resistant gloves, abrasion-resistant gloves, heat-resistant gloves, tons of different types, right? Then, you have obviously gloves, surgical gloves, right, for protecting from blood, etc. And depending on what you're doing, you want to make sure you have the right glove. And the process of selecting the right gloves, sometimes we rely on the customer to do it, right? Like ExxonMobil, for an example, they have a impact glove only and on every location, on every person, all the time. Must have impact gloves on your person, on your hands at all times. And, there are times where impact gloves are absolutely essential. There are times where they would potentially cause more of a hazard. So I'm not saying to, buck that with your customers, but when you're internally determining hand protection for different types of tasks, keep in mind exactly what you're doing and what worst case scenario is for hand injury, and make sure that you take that into consideration when you're selecting your gloves. So inspecting these a little bit like boots, right? Like cuts, tears, rips, cracks if they have rubber or plastic parts on them, making sure that they're in good shape. The other thing I didn't mention in the last one, but I'd be remiss if I didn't, is some chemical resistant gloves are resistant against certain chemicals, and against other chemicals they can actually fuse and bond and create hazardous chemicals. So just keep that in mind, that the chemicals used to make the gloves do have to be compatible with the chemicals that you're working with. And the best way to do that to identify and verify is the SDS. It'll tell you. Fall protection. Again, lots of different types of fall protection. Really depends on, are you going to wear this for 15 minutes or 15 hours, right? You want to make sure that it fits comfortably. You want to make sure that it's secured and able to be fit tight, but not too tight. You want to make sure that it has the big thing about this actually is where the D-ring placements are. So where can you tie this thing off, right? Like where do you hook your lanyards onto? And some harnesses, they have one D-ring right in the center of your back. That's it. In the center of your shoulder blades. That's it. That's all you get. And that's not always ideal, especially if you're working at heights and you have an SRL on. Maybe you don't want to have it connected to the center of your shoulder blades. Maybe there's a better spot. So just making sure that, the type, now those are typically more expensive, the fancier you get, but you just want to make sure it's the right type. Tags must be legible on them. That's important. They do need to be inspected each time before use, but then absolutely at least once a year they need to be thoroughly physically inspected. And you want to make sure connectors aren't rusted or getting tied up. They should be able to move freely. General work clothing, just kind of overall. We went over this a little bit before with FR, for flame resistance, or if there's going to be a flash fire, that's going to give you a few seconds of protection, particularly for flash fires. But they will catch on fire, so don't be like, I can run into a burning building and be completely immune. That's not what they're designed for. So we don't want to have loose clothing or jewelry, especially when we're around equipment or material with articulating or rotating parts that are unguarded, because the clothing and material can get pulled in. A lot of people have been hurt and maimed and killed this way. Also rings, I have a rubber ring on when I'm out in the field, wedding band, and I think the one that my wife got me has like a breaking point that's a little bit better than metal, but those are all things you want to keep in mind. There are safety rings that are a little bit nicer that do have like tension breaks in them, etc. But you just want to make sure that loose clothing, jewelry, etc. just don't have that stuff on at work. All right, so wrapping this section up here, just remember that every job and every department, you need to assess the tasks that you're doing and compare that to what hazards are there, and then ultimately what PPE must be selected. Now, when you're doing that hazard assessment, again, PPE is the last thing you want to think of, That's one of the parts, but you want to think about elimination first or substitution. So if you say, hey, this thing could fall and drop in my hand, I need impact gloves, right? Well, the question is, can we prevent it from falling in the first place? Can we work somewhere else? Can we secure it? Can we tie it off, chain it off, bolt it up? What can we do to prevent this thing from hitting you? And then once we've done all of those other administrative elimination controls, engineering controls, all those different factors, then we say, yes, worst case scenario, this PPE is going to do its job. But there's a reason that when people, for example, get in fights, that they don't just put on safety glasses and they're magically safe from being harmed, right? Like, all PPE does have limitations, and you need to keep that in mind as well, because if Mike Tyson punches you in the face, a pair of Z87 Nemesis glasses is only going to do so much, so when it comes to equipment, materials, metals, etc., we just got to keep that in mind. Each part of the body needs to be taken into consideration. There's forms for this that you can purchase, that you can make yourself, where you assess the job, and then one of those elements again is PPE. And then lastly, we want to make sure that when you give the PPE or you're wearing the PPE, you're replacing it when it's needed. Now, some companies are reticent to replace PPE for use of wear and tear because they're concerned people will just, trash it. But that's a conversation you need to have, because, ultimately, the company's responsible to assess what PPE you need to wear and then also replace it when it's. They can't just say, well, we bought you a pair of safety glasses in 1997, so you're good for it's on your dime for the rest of the time you're working here. That's not acceptable. All right, our next topic, noise exposure and hearing conservation. We want to protect people from hazardous noise. So the first thing we want to assess again is, where do we know that there is noise? Here's just some examples. We have frac sites around compressors, compressor stations, pumps, pumping units aren't typically super loud unless they're an Ajax style. Heavy equipment, as well as trucks, loaders, semis, welding equipment, drills, grinders, hammers, anything where there's impact that's creating noise, or pumps or engines that's making noise. That's typically where we're going to see a lot of noise in our industry. So we'll talk about the effects here first. So the biggest thing about noise exposure, and we'll get a little bit more into this in a couple slides here, but the biggest thing is that over time, it will damage the nerves on your inner ear, which look a little bit like grass in there. So imagine a bunch of little hairs, but instead they're microscopic nerves. And a little bit of noise here and there is not going to damage them. But like grass, a large noise will permanently, instantly damage it. If you drive a dozer or a track hoe across a freshly cut lawn of grass, that grass is wrecked permanently. It might grow back in sparse patches, but it's pretty much done. Same thing is true if you walk across a lawn. Walking across a lawn, no problem, not going to cause any issues. If people are constantly walking across one line of grass, that grass will die and it will not come back. The nerves of your inner ear are similar, where once they die, they do not grow back. So natural hearing loss, this is part of the challenge of really identifying hearing loss as a part of occupational health and safety, is it happens no matter what you do, right? Like you could be living in a soundproof box over the course of your life, and at the end of your life, your hearing will be worse than when you first started. It may be to a lesser degree, but that's the reality of our situation. So it's a little bit challenging to kind of determine if it's workplace related or if it's just natural. I will say, however, that workplace noises and loud noises and high exposure to loud noises over time will absolutely damage your hearing prematurely. So here's some decibel ratings, for example. So threshold of pain is right about or above an airplane, right? An airplane engine is right about that level. Then kind of as you go down here, extremely loud is considered 110 decibels. Very loud is considered 90. Then you kind of go down loud. Vehicles are in the loud range, right? Talking can be in the loud range. Like I typically speak between 70 and 80 decibels. Yelling, you can get about 100 and 110. Alarms on like gas detection equipment are typically operating around 130, 140. Now again, that's important because you want to be loud, but you don't want to blast people's eardrums out, right? There's kind of a happy medium there, but at these 140 levels, for example, that is a decibel rating that if you Once it hits you, those nerves are getting damaged. End of story. Like, they're going to be damaged. The question is how much, right? So over time, the 2-foot threshold, if you have to shout, is kind of the way that we determine it being, quote, too loud. If you're 2 feet away from someone and you have to shout to be heard, it's causing some damage potentially. Here's kind of the anatomy of an ear. We have the inner ear, the ear canal, which obviously allows sound through. You have the eardrum, the middle ear, I already mentioned that, and then the eustachian tube. I'm pretty sure I pronounced that correctly. And that in that little area, especially in the inner ear, is where those nerves are. So long-term noise exposure happens. There's no such thing as, getting used to it or immunity to loud noise. It just slowly damages more. It's like saying grass is immune to a track dozer, right? It's just not, a track hoe. It's not going to happen. It's going to damage it. You can recover from short-term noises because those nerves will flatten first, right? And just like grass, if it gets flattened, it'll come back up. No big deal. But again, just the constant pounding is going to, they'll die. And then they don't grow back. So effects are usually gradual. So let's say you're around 85 decibels, which is kind of our occupational limit, right? You're around that every day for 9 hours a day. That's going to slowly, and truck drivers experience this, even just from the window being down in their truck a little bit and the wind whistling through, that can be 90 decibels. So every day, in and out, 9 hours a day, 8 hours a day, that's going to cause damage to your ear. So human speech, sadly, is one of the first things we lose the ability to hear. It's in a certain range, and then when people get tinnitus, what that is it's actually a loss of range in your hearing. So when you hear that ringing in your ears, that's a little bit of your body telling you, hey bro, like bad things are happening. Overexposure to loud noise can cause that tinnitus, and it can be severe enough to disrupt sleep, cause anxiety, depression, etc., because you just kind of have this constant background noise in your head. So severity of nerve damage depends on 2 things. As we talked about, decibel rating and then length of time exposed. Those are the 2 main factors. Guns are, probably one of the leading causes of hearing damage in our areas, people shooting off guns, which we like to do. The hearing protection, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, can be designed to block the noise of guns and loud noises, anything over 120 decibels, but then allow for lower ranges, lower spectrums of sound to be heard, such as the human voice. So keep that in mind. You might say, well, I like to shoot guns, but I want to hear Billy talking to me. Well, there's custom fits. You can get them at Scheels, Cabela's, Dick's Sporting Goods, really anywhere you can get these made or purchased and make them yourself. So noise exposure, time to damage. All right, I've talked a lot of generalities. Here's some facts. So 85 decibels, we know at 8 hours, you start to get hearing damage to a smaller extent. At 90 decibels, it's 4. At 100 decibels, it's 1. At 105, it's 30 minutes. At 110, it's 15 minutes. And what I want you to notice here, it's literally a doubling effect at every 5 decibels. So every time it goes up 5, it halves or doubles the impact of the noise on your inner ears. So, hearing protection. Now, there's been a lot of things used in the past, and yes, covering your ear canals with your hands will prevent some decibels going through. Absolutely. But, sticking stuff in there, cigarette butts were a pretty common thing back in the day in industry. Cotton swabs have been used a lot. These will offer a little bit, maybe a decibel or 2, maybe even up to 3, right? 3 decibels. But when you're talking about 110 to 107 decibels, the damage is pretty much equal, one way or the other. So earmuffs are the highest level of protection, as I mentioned, and these can be combined with earplugs. In fact, anything over 100 decibels, that's the recommendation. So there's some advantages and specs to these. Obviously, best level of protection. They're durable. They can filter out specific pitches as well. They can be clamped on your hard hat. There's a lot of benefits to these, but there are some disadvantages, just like all PPE. One of those disadvantages is that they're expensive. They're also bulky, and they can prevent audible communication from coworkers if they don't have that specific, technology built into them. Some of them even have radios inside, so like Billy, you can hear Billy on the radio, but the ambient sound is blocked out. Another, thing about them that can be a disadvantage if you're working in the heat. These can significantly increase your body temperature. Earplugs are good. This is kind of the medium level of protection. You can get them in different materials. You can get them in different sizes. They're disposable. They're typically inexpensive. They're lightweight. And then you can customize these as well. They look a little bit different than the foam style, but the plugs, you can get them customized to your ear, and then also, again, to filter out specific ranges of sound. They can fall out. They can get dirty, and there's a few things about them we don't like, but ultimately, that's kind of our medium protection area. Now, inserting them is a little bit of a process. You want to, and I mentioned this earlier, but the outer part of your ear is called the pinna, where this guy is holding the top of your ear. That's the pinna. So you elevate the pinna, which opens up your ear canal. You want to squeeze the rubber or the plastic down tightly and then insert it. It should expand to fill your ear canal. If it falls out immediately, there's two reasons. Either it pushes itself out because it's too large, or it falls out because it's too small. So you want to make sure that it fits your ear size. A lot of the foam ones are designed to expand and hold at any different size, but keep that in mind as you're doing that. So hearing protection, the worst possible hearing protection is something called a canal cap. This is good for more dust than anything. I mean, you're going to get a couple decibel limits on this, but that's about it. So really, these aren't great. So occasional use only, protect mostly from dust, and again, 2 to 5 decibels, per ear, or even overall, depending. All right, so the noise reduction rating I just mentioned per ear. So this is unique. They give you an overall noise reduction rating, but you have 2 ears. So one thing you want to keep in mind is that each of your ears is its own entity that needs a noise reduction rating. So you have to half this number and apply it to each ear. So if it says a 30 decibel NRR, it's actually 15 per ear. So when you buy hearing protection, a plug for example, it's going to say 20 decibels NRR or 30 decibel NRR. You have to measure the sound around you and then half that number, and that's what your ear is exposed to, right? So if I measure the sound around me and it's 100 decibels, and I buy 30 decibel NRR rated earplugs, that's actually going to bring it from 100 decibels minus 15, which is half, which is 85. So now I can be around that sound for 8 hours without any hearing damage, or again, that's right at the threshold, right? So you might get a little bit of hearing damage realistically, but that's kind of the threshold. And that's the way that you calculate it. So you take that number, you divide it by 2. Again, you get the 110, 112. There are no earplugs off the shelf that will protect you from that. You're going to have to go custom at that point. And again, whenever you see the NRR, you got to divide it by half. So hearing protection, again, it's required above 85 decibels. So if you can get one of those little sound meters. Now, this is the thing, if you're working within working distance of it, right? If you have a compressor outside the building in the corner of the lot that's running at 100 decibels, you don't have to wear hearing protection inside of the shop because there's something out there that's, at a higher decibel rating. It depends on where you're working. So within your working area, again, for $80 online, Amazon, you can buy these little sound decibel meters, and it will tell you how loud it is. And that's going to help you determine your hearing protection level. So we want to make sure we're using the right stuff. We don't want to use pistols, for example, to plug our ears with. That's a bad idea. I want to take this photo down because I've used it. If you've been through this course a few times, you've seen it, but I just love it. It's sometimes we just use what we have, right? But, if you have a pistol, just don't use that for your hearing protection. The common excuses for not wearing it is, I was just walking out there for a minute, or it's just real quick. But again, as we know, that even one moment of loud noise can cause that nerve damage that will cause long-term hearing damage. So the other thing that we do with people that are exposed to loud noises is we do audiometric testing. So this is typically done when a person first starts, and then ordinarily every year we'll test you again. There's always going to be hearing loss in that audiometric testing, especially after you get over the age of 30, 35. But we're going to test that hearing loss versus, average hearing loss for a person of that age, and then determine, hey man, are you wearing your hearing protection? Are you not wearing it? Versus just hoping over the course of a career that your hearing isn't getting too bad. This will give us actual data, and then maybe improve the type or quality, or actually use the hearing protection in the first place. That's the purpose of audiometric testing. So most people develop, again, the mild hearing loss. This is what you'll have to wear. If you lose your hearing, it'll be a hearing aid. This is not always very comfortable. They can be pretty annoying to wear. Different companies have different ones now. Even Jabra has some, but these are the component parts of a hearing aid. So typically we're going to do this every year and make sure that things are working properly. All right, so medical personnel records for your hearing tests are available to you, and the company has to hold on to those for 30 years. So if you come and ask for them, hey man, I want to see my hearing test records, I can't tell you that that's private or proprietary. No, those are your medical records. So if they are doing them, make sure you look at the results. Just be like, oh, I got my hearing test done, I'm good. Be like, oh, let me check this versus the year before, etc. All right, so lastly, I don't put this in every single one because it's a little bit onerous, but every year we give away a gun here at Basin Safety for giving us a review. So if you go online to Google or Facebook and give us a review, say, hey, I took this course, or I like these guys, or even if you don't like these guys and you're like, man, Basin Safety, Griner puts me to sleep every single month. It's hard to listen to him. He's boring. His jokes aren't funny. Fine, put that in the review. You still get entered in for the drawing. They don't have to be good reviews, but hopefully, we do a decent job. So yeah, you go to Google or Facebook, look us up, give us a review, say how we did, be as thorough as you can with the review, tell the world how amazing these courses are, then you have the chance to win the gun. So the picture there is actually the last guy who won the gun. So we do give it away, or financial equivalent if you're not allowed to own firearms. I'm just joking. Or if you don't want a gun, then you get the financial equivalent. So again, thank you very much, guys, for being involved and for listening to this month's safety presentation. Take these practices, put them out there to work for you, and let's keep this safety going.